We are witnessing an event that could dramatically reshape our familiar world. Saudi Arabia, a long-standing ally of the United States, is reconsidering its role in the petrodollar system. Recently, they announced that they would not be extending the agreement that has upheld the US dollar as the global reserve currency for decades. What does this mean for America and for all of us? Why could this decision by the Arab nation in 2025 turn the global economy upside down? Have you ever wondered why the dollar became the world's dominant currency? It might seem like it was always this way, but the history of reserve currencies reveals that this status has shifted over time, much like a relay baton. Before the dollar, other powerful currencies held this position. Let's go back to the early 18th century, when the world looked to France and its livre as the primary currency for international trade. At the time, France was at the height of its power, and its money was valued across the globe. But as the world evolved, by the 19th century, Great Britain emerged as the leading trade and colonial power. From that point until the early 20th century, the British pound reigned supreme in global finance. Imagine this: the pound was like the dollar of its time, held in reserves and used everywhere, from Europe to Asia. And then, after World War II, the world underwent another seismic shift. The United States solidified its influence, and the dollar replaced the pound as the top currency. But what happens if the dollar loses this status, as the livre and pound did before it? After World War II, the world craved stability, which led to the signing of the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944. At this historic meeting, nations agreed that the dollar would serve as the primary currency for international transactions. The dollar was backed by the U.S. gold reserves, giving America a significant economic advantage. Global trade was conducted in dollars, and it was beneficial for other countries to hold their reserves in this currency. However, by the early 1970s, the U.S. faced financial challenges that forced it to rethink the gold backing for the dollar. Not all countries supported this arrangement. In 1965, French President Charles de Gaulle openly opposed the world's reliance on the dollar, stating that the dollar had become too dominant. He demanded that the U.S. exchange France's dollar reserves for gold. This move posed a significant risk to the U.S. economy, as despite the dollar's status as the global currency, America lacked sufficient gold reserves to cover all dollars in circulation. De Gaulle's demands sent a strong message to the U.S., and shortly thereafter, America abandoned the gold standard. This decision ended the dollar's gold backing, leaving it reliant solely on U.S. political and economic influence. Today, for most people, the word currency is synonymous with the dollar. But this dominance didn't arise naturally. It was the result of deliberate political maneuvers and economic agreements. In 1974, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia signed a historic petrodollar pact. Saudi Arabia would sell oil exclusively in dollars, and in return, America would provide military protection and advanced technologies. This agreement solidified the dollar as the global reserve currency, creating enormous demand for it. Consider this: to sustain demand for the dollar, there are over $32 trillion in U.S. debt obligations held worldwide. This means nearly every country stores reserves in dollars, and corporations earn revenue in this currency, keeping them dependent on the U.S. economy. For example, China and Japan, the largest creditors to the U.S., each hold over $1 trillion in American debt. They cannot afford a dollar collapse because it would instantly devalue their own assets. But here's the paradox. Any move away from the dollar, such as Saudi Arabia's withdrawal, makes a crisis more likely. On one hand, countries are compelled to support the dollar, yet on the other, it increasingly drifts away from its intrinsic value. Every new rejection of the dollar is like a domino, potentially triggering a cascade. Every time the U.S. prints money to cover its expenses, the ripple effects are felt by millions globally. Europe provides a clear example. When the U.S. turned on its money printer after the 2008 financial crisis, Europe paid the price with inflation rates soaring to 10%. And that's just the direct impact. Now imagine the impact on commodity markets, where prices are dollar-based. Even if oil and gas prices drop, the strengthening of the dollar during global crises or due to Federal Reserve actions makes oil more expensive for countries purchasing it in dollars. This is particularly hard on developing nations, where every fluctuation in the dollar leads to higher fuel prices, and consequently, increased costs for food and transportation. Picture yourself in Brazil, a country that imports a significant amount of goods priced in dollars. When the U.S. increases the money supply, It often causes prices in Brazilian stores to rise. This happens because the cost of imports paid in dollars grows, and those higher costs ultimately reach consumers. Take Turkey, for example, where inflation is rampant, and the value of the dollar dictates nearly everything, from the price of apartments and cars to basic groceries. That's why if the dollar stops being the universal currency, it won't just affect the US, it will upend the entire system of global market pricing. But what happens to the global economy if the dollar truly loses its status? Saudi Arabia's decision to move away from the dollar in oil transactions isn't just a contract change. It opens the door for other nations to use their own currencies, reducing global dependence on the dollar. Already, countries like China, Russia, and members of BRICS are pushing for de-dollarization by switching to settlements in their currencies and leveraging digital platforms. This threatens to weaken the dollar's role as the world's reserve currency, a blow not only to the US economy, but potentially to the global financial system anchored to it. Currently, more than $7 trillion in US dollars is held in foreign banks. If the petrodollar system starts to unravel, these trillions could destabilize the global financial system. A collapse could lead to a sharp decline in the value of these assets, sparking a financial crisis. For example, if Saudi Arabia begins accepting yuan for oil, it could set a precedent, prompting other nations to follow suit. The resulting mass exodus from dollar-based assets could cause a global market panic. Remember 2008, when the US subprime mortgage crisis triggered a worldwide banking collapse. The rejection of the dollar as the global currency could lead to a crisis of similar or even greater magnitude. Here's another critical factor. Every dollar circulating outside the US helps sustain the American economy. Think about this. 60% of all global currency reserves are in dollars. If countries shift to other currencies, those dollars would begin to flow back into the US, potentially triggering catastrophic inflation. For comparison, after the 2020 crisis, the Federal Reserve's money printing caused inflation to spike to 9%, driving up prices for goods and real estate. Now imagine what would happen if all those return dollars suddenly flooded the American economy. Prices could easily double or triple. To grasp the potential fallout, consider Venezuela. When its national currency collapsed, inflation skyrocketed to over 1,000,000%. While such an extreme scenario is unlikely for the dollar in the short term, a large-scale sell-off could still make American goods, from groceries to gasoline, unaffordable, even for Americans themselves. Another example is Turkey, where in 2022, the Turkish lira lost more than 40% of its value, causing the price of imported goods to double. Now imagine the US facing a similar situation. The breakdown of the petrodollar agreement with Saudi Arabia isn't just a risk for the US, it's a major threat to the entire global financial system upon which the current order is built. But if Saudi Arabia and other nations turn away from the dollar, what currencies might replace it, and who would stand to gain? While the US and EU work to maintain their financial dominance, BRICS countries and their allies are developing their own payment systems, such as BRICS Pay and digital currencies aimed at bypassing the dollar. These platforms allow nations to evade sanctions and reduce the dollar's influence. Saudi Arabia's interest in aligning with the BRICS framework has further heightened US concerns. A key tool for de-dollarization is digital currency, and China is leading the charge. Alongside Saudi Arabia and other partners, China is spearheading a project to create a digital currency as an alternative for international transactions. The initiative has already reached the stage of a minimum viable product, signaling that this currency could soon be used for major transactions like oil exports, bypassing the dollar entirely. If a global system without the dollar emerges, what will happen to the world economy as we know it? Russia and China have already shifted to bilateral trade, with over 90% of their transactions now conducted in national currencies, cutting the dollar out of the equation. This significantly reduces US economic leverage over both nations, as they no longer need to constantly convert assets into dollars. This approach saves billions on currency fluctuations and fosters financial independence. For instance, before 2014, over 70% of trade between Russia and China was settled in dollars. Today, that figure has dropped to under 10%. This stark change underscores the global push to move away from the dollar in strategic partnerships. Since 2022, the GDP of BRICS countries has surpassed that of G7 countries for the first time, indicating the alliance's growing economic influence. This coalition is building an entire infrastructure where countries can conduct financial transactions bypassing the dollar. For example, the BRICS Pay payment system is not just an alternative to SWIFT, but a full-fledged network for cross-border transfers and digital currency exchanges. If the system operates at full capacity, member countries will be able to settle with each other in digital currencies, creating a financial ecosystem independent of the dollar. Imagine buying a smartphone, and previously you had to pay in dollars. Its price depended on the exchange rate. But now China can sell the same smartphones for yuan to BRICS countries. For African or Latin American countries, this is a real benefit, since they won't depend on expensive dollar conversions and can stabilize their economic relations. Another example is India. When importing oil from Russia, it has begun paying in rubles or rupees, reducing costs on oil deals. Now imagine if such changes became global, leaving the dollar with only the status of an internal US currency. But which of these new players can take the dollar's place, and are they ready to offer the world a true alternative? If the dollar loses its reserve currency status, it won't just affect America. The cost of imports into the US will rise, meaning higher prices for a wide range of goods, from electronics to raw materials. Oil prices, currently determined primarily in dollars, will begin to fluctuate. Our usual financial practices might no longer remain relevant. Let's compare the US economy to other countries. China is known as the world's factory, producing massive volumes of technology, electronics, and consumer goods. Germany exports cars and machinery. Russia is a major supplier of energy resources, and India actively exports software and pharmaceuticals. The US, besides technology and culture, mainly exports dollars, as global trade relies on them. Essentially, America's economic influence rests on demand for its currency. If the dollar loses its reserve currency status, the US will lose a significant portion of its economic influence, and ordinary consumers worldwide, including Americans themselves, will face a tangible rise in prices for many goods. Today, around 60% of all imported consumption in America consists of goods purchased from abroad. If the dollar loses its status as a reserve currency, its declining value will inevitably impact prices. Imagine an average American's grocery basket filled with clothing, electronics, and household items. More than half of these are imported. If the dollar's value drops, the cost of such items could increase by 30 to 50%. And this issue isn't limited to Americans. In countries where the dollar is used for exchange transactions, rising prices due to a weaker dollar will also affect consumers in Europe, Asia, and Latin America. Inflation in the US could climb to double-digit figures, as a weaker dollar would make foreign travel and even imported medicines practically unaffordable luxuries. Even short-term drops in the dollar's value already have a significant impact on global markets. For instance, in 2021, when the dollar lost just 5% of its value, prices for many goods jumped by 15 to 20%. If the dollar's decline as a reserve currency becomes a long-term trend, the cost of goods could rise exponentially. While goods in the US become more expensive, the cost and availability of essentials, such as gasoline, food, and electronics, in other countries, particularly developing ones, could become prohibitively high. Imagine you're a European student planning to study in the US. With rising costs due to a weakening dollar, not only would tuition become more expensive, but day-to-day living costs would also skyrocket. Or consider another scenario. In countries that purchase energy in dollars, gasoline prices could soar. For example, Mexico, which buys a significant portion of its oil in dollars, would feel the impact at every gas station if it has to switch to other currencies or pay more for a devalued dollar. Let's explore what it would mean for everyday Americans if the dollar lost its status as the world's currency. Think about how daily expenses, loans, and even vacations abroad could change in such a scenario. First, let's discuss expenses. Suppose the dollar is no longer in high demand abroad. This means that every international trip or purchase, be it a vacation in Europe or shopping on foreign websites, would become significantly more expensive. A weaker dollar would mean that your money no longer holds the same purchasing power outside the US. Imagine ordering a new gadget from abroad, only to find it suddenly 30 to 50% more expensive due to the dollar's decline. The same applies to vacations. Airfare, hotels, and even basic expenses like meals and tours would drastically increase in price. Now about loans. If the dollar loses its status as a reserve currency, the US will have to pay more on its debts, and this cost will inevitably affect Americans. Taking out a mortgage or car loan will become more difficult because interest rates will rise. So if you are planning to buy a house or a car, the payments on these loans could increase significantly. For many, this will simply close access to such large purchases. What about international relations? Today, with the dollar as the world's primary currency, the U.S. holds financial leverage that allows it to impose sanctions and control global monetary flows. If the dollar loses its role, many countries will be freer to conduct transactions in other currencies. This means that the ability of the U.S. to influence other countries through economic measures and sanctions will be limited. America's influence will weaken, and its allies will start looking toward other financial centers, such as China, Europe, or Russia. Imagine a world where the U.S. no longer holds a leading position in the global economy. What might it look like? Picture the U.S. economy as a powerful engine fueled by a constant inflow of liquidity. The main driver of this inflow is the dollar, which America exports worldwide. But how does this process support economic growth, create liquidity, and encourage investment? The secret lies in the dollar's unique status as the world's reserve currency, which creates a steady demand for dollar-denominated assets. Foreign countries and central banks accumulate dollars in their reserves to conduct international transactions, pay for imports, and purchase energy resources like oil. This constant demand for the dollar allows the U.S. to attract unlimited capital, including through the sale of government bonds. Ultimately, this demand keeps borrowing rates low within the country, creating favorable conditions for economic growth. Thanks to this demand, the U.S. can finance domestic projects, infrastructure programs, and stimulate growth through investments in science and technology. Additionally, the dollar as a reserve currency acts as a kind of pressure valve for the global economy. Whenever the U.S. economy faces a crisis, new dollars can be injected into the global system, mitigating inflationary shocks at home. As long as dollars circulate worldwide, their surplus does not exert as much pressure on the domestic market as it would if these funds remained confined within the country. However, if Saudi Arabia and other countries begin to abandon the dollar in favor of alternative currencies, the world will no longer absorb the excess dollars. What does this mean? Inflation within the U.S. will rise, and the loans that have supported the economy for so long will become much more expensive. Without the export of dollars, it will be harder for the United States to finance its deficit, and the American market will start losing its investment appeal. Thus, the loss of the dollar's reserve status will change the established rules of the game. It will affect all of us, from the prices of groceries and gasoline to mortgage rates and credit card interest. What role will other currencies play in the global economy? And will the dollar be able to retain its influence? The answers to these questions will shape the future of the global financial system and the lives of every one of us. Share your thoughts on the future of the dollar in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and thank you for watching.